Hello and welcome to Ethical Leadership, Voices from Aotearoa, New Zealand, a podcast series commissioned by the Brian Picot Chair in Ethical Leadership, Aritahi, at Victoria University of Wellington, and produced by advisory firm Pocket Knife. This podcast series aims to demystify ethics and make ethical leadership a concept we all become more fluent in and a skill we all become more nimble with. My name is Hélène Malandin, Director of Pocket Knife, and it is my pleasure to be your host for this episode of our podcast series. Today I'm excited to be joined by Caren Rangi. Caren is a distinguished New Zealand governance leader, cultural advocate, and public sector professional, widely recognized for her contributions to the arts, community development, and Pacific leadership. A proud New Zealand-born Cook Islands Maori, Caren chose to be a leader in the field of governance so she can influence decision-making in areas that she is passionate about. Amongst other roles, this has included being a governor for the Arts Council of New Zealand, Creative New Zealand, the Broadcasting Commission, New Zealand on Air, the Pro-Chancellor for Massey University, and most recently, New Zealand Rugby. Caren has now been serving as a professional director for over 2 decades, promoting excellence in governance and leadership across the public and non-for-profit sectors, while championing greater equity for Pacific peoples in Aotearoa. In recognition of a significant service to governance and the Pacific community, Caren Rangi was appointed an Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit, or NZM, in the 2018 Queen's Birthday Honours. She is also a Chartered Fellow of the Institute of Directors and is known for her commitment to values-based leadership, cultural integrity, and inclusive decision-making. It is my pleasure to welcome Caren on the podcast today. Caren, kia ora, a warm welcome to you.
Kia ora, Helene. It's lovely to be here with you.
Thank you. So Caren, one of the topics I would love us to talk about today is the role of governance in fostering strong organizational culture and governance contribution to organizational success. But before we talk about boards as a group of individuals working together, I would really like to discuss the individuals themselves. So what does it take to be a good governor, in other words? So you mentioned to me that most people may not think about ethics until they are tested. So from your 25 plus years of experience as a professional governor, what do you think makes a good director? What do you think makes a director with strong ethics?
Yeah, I'd start by saying that governance is not for the faint-hearted, right? You've got to have a certain amount of courage to make hard decisions, to exercise your independent view, to work alongside others who are also exercising their views, but all moving towards a common cause. And so the role of governors and the extent to which their own ethics get tested sort of works well when people are really conscious and really clear about their own values as an individual, but how they contribute that to setting values, standards, expected behaviours that are okay for the group as a whole. And I'd like to think more boards are doing that more consciously these days, because if you don't do it consciously, obviously when you do get tested, so where you are making decisions where perhaps your own personal views are being tested or your colleagues' views are being tested, that's when you start to realise that it's much easier when you've got some certainty about what's okay and what's not okay for the group as a whole. So good governors are groups of people who are consistent in their commitment to their shared purpose, but they do take time to test it out because, things do change, right? And people's attitudes change. They are really focused on making sure that the relationships around the table and therefore the culture of the decision-making group is strong. And that's really to, invest in the times when they're going to be making those really tricky decisions that do test you both personally, professionally, and for the group. There are groups of people who are prepared to, first of all, hold themselves to account, hold each other to account, and then hold those who are working for them to account. So there's really got to be that accountability in place. And then the last thing I would say is that there are groups of people who are confident, because they've got good processes in place, that they are being compliant, both with the law and with the LORE, coming back to those expected values and behaviours. And so really good governors are people who can be confident that that's what is happening when they are together making decisions. So the piece through that around values and what people's expectations are about a good culture to support the decision making, I think are absolutely integral to thinking about ethical decision making and ethical leadership, because governors are leaders.
Amazing. And it may be useful for people who are listening to this to think, to maybe define in your own words the role of boards, because I'm listening to you thinking there's a lot in there that is also valid, I suppose, for anyone who's operating at very high level in an organization. What makes it different when you're on a board? And maybe that's grounded into the role of a board, right? So we're not just sitting around the senior leadership table. We're sitting together as governors.
Absolutely. And maybe it might be useful if I talk about it in parallel with what is the role of senior management who are sitting around the table, right?
Yes.
So the board's role, first and foremost, is to set the tone for the organisation. And you know that saying, that the fish rots from the head. So basically, if the kind of behaviours and values are not clear at the top, they're not going to be clear through the organisation. So that's a really important part. The board is there to be stewards, really, of the resources and the people that they are responsible for a period of time. And one of the challenges of the board's role is actually to be continually focused on taking the organisation or the group into the future. So while senior management and staff are busy working on the shop floor, getting the work done, the board's role principally is to look to the future and think about the decisions they're making today that are going to take the organisation down a good future pathway, but always to be focused on that horizon. The board's role is to, on top of the setting the right culture, and also being stewards, I guess that thing about being strong collective decision makers to underpin the strategy that's in place. So it makes it clear to those who are working for them and with them that that is the framework in which things are being expected to happen. Yeah. So, I think I already said it's not for the faint-hearted, right? Because you really have to have some confidence that the decisions you make today are going to stand the organisation in good stead in the future. And we know that things that are in place today aren't necessarily going to be in place in the future. So there's a little bit of faith that's involved, and it's collective faith that actually we're going to make the right decision today.
Yeah. And I'd like to pick up on what you said about like the difference between the board and many differences between the board and the senior management team, but in particular, that time scale difference. And I suppose what you were saying about checking in with being clear on our ethics and our values as a group of governors, in order to make the best decision for the organization. There's something there about maybe having the distance, like you said, the senior management team is on the floor. So you've got that distance that is supposed to be helpful, but also like the most challenging thing, maybe, where you need to be able to guide strategy intentionally based on shared values and ethics. Do you want to talk to what that looks like? Because there's a lot of intentionality in there. It sounds like there needs to be a lot of intentionality in there. What could this intentionality look like if we do things well?
And I think it goes right back to what motivates people to even come onto boards in the first place, right? And really, organisations have got a chance of working well if individuals, as they are arriving at the board table, are clear that the reason that they are there is because they're committed to the purpose of the organisation. Now, we know that's not always the case, right? There are times when people have other interests, but if it's working well, then they're arriving at the table saying, this is why I'm here, and this is what I'm prepared to contribute to make sure that we're making good collective decisions. One of the challenges, I guess, for people coming onto the boards is because they're either passionate about the organisation or committed to the cause that it's there for. But sometimes it turns out that what they're really interested in is actually being on the shop floor, right? That they're probably better at that. So they are two quite different roles. The board is definitely an oversight, future-focused role. The staff on the floor is an execution in the now type role, implementation, getting the work done. And there does have to be some separation between them. And in the old days, we used to talk about the separation between governance and management. So the board sits here and the staff sit here, never the twain shall meet. Modern day governance actually says it's a shared leadership role. So really, it's more like this. And we talk about people, it's important people stay in their lane. So the board stays here and doesn't interfere, etc. And I think that is definitely true. But the important thing about being in those lanes is more like synchronized swimming, right? You've still got to be swimming in your lane at the same pace, in the same direction, in order to do well by the organisation. And I think we've all seen examples of organisations where there's been a misalignment between the pace and intent of the board and the staff. So either the senior management are a million miles an hour out here and the board's still catching up, or vice versa, the board's got really grand plans, but not clearly communicating them to the poor people who have to do the work. So that having collective clarity about what the organisation is there for, individual clarity and collective clarity, I should say, about everybody's respective roles and responsibilities, and really clear sets of arrangements between the board and those doing the work as to the direction we're going in and the pace that's going to be serve the organisation.
So it sounds like a lot of foundational work that needs to be done, and I'm sure revisited, no doubt, through, an organization evolving and boards changing and personnel changes. What have you seen? A lot, of course, but maybe let's start with what works before we talk about instances of when things don't go well. What have you seen that maybe needed, even like examples, because I'm sure there's no rules, but in terms of building these foundations, what can be?
So one of the strongest success factors are for boards who actually make time to deliberately develop their relationship around the table, so that they're clear on the rules of engagement. They're clear on what they do, what they're going to do if they get to a point which they can't agree on things, and there will be points, right? It's a normal part of the business. It's not bad, but a good sound board would have thought of that before you got to that point and would have agreed, okay, we're here. What are our rules of engagement to ensure that we can have a robust discussion, we can disagree agreeably, and we can end up at a point where we've got a better collective decision than what we might have had at the beginning. So actually, and it's really as practical, just recently, having joined a new board, we were able to have that conversation on the first day we met, which is, what are the optimal conditions for you sitting at this table? And actually, what is it that really, really annoys you or throws you off or means that you can't operate well at the table? Because it's better that we talk about it now rather than find out as it's happening. And one of my examples was that I operate well if I feel that everybody is being heard and I'm being heard. So I really struggle if I'm in a room with people and they just talk across each other. I find it rude. I find it's not constructive, and it takes you much longer to get to a decision, so it doesn't work. So even just the having the conversation with colleagues meant that even when people are really enthusiastically talking over other people, they sort of go, actually, that's right, sorry, I'm really sorry about that. So it's setting the tone very consciously by saying, what's the optimal relationship we want to have? How is that going to work? What's going to be your part? What's going to be my part? How are we going to check the temperature on it? So that's the second part of it. So you can set the rules, but how are you going to just check in now and then that in fact that's how you are operating? One of the practices in a number of my boards is at the end of a board meeting is actually, and you point someone at the beginning and say, okay, how did we do in terms of keeping to our values, our culture, our expected behaviours? Did we do it? Or did we talked about it, but we completely ignored it? What worked well, what didn't work well? So you're just keeping conscious of those undertakings that you've made to each other. The third thing I'll say is that where it really does play out is as part of the board's risk management responsibility, because obviously the buck stops with the board, and one of the key functions of any board is to identify the risks to success and then make sure there's plans in place to manage or mitigate them. It's really hard to do that role unless you've had a collective conversation about what's risky for us. And we all come to the table with different levels of tolerance or appetite for risk, right? But the challenge is, what is the right level of appetite for the organisation? And if you haven't had that conversation, when you go on then to do your risk management, you'd be operating from quite different vantage points. So there's a couple of practical things about what it looks like if it works well, and then what happens if you haven't done the foundation work.
So if I hear you well, there's obviously very important conversations at strategic level for an organization, because I would put the risk conversation in the strategic bucket, strategically, what can we afford to risk as an organization? And then what you said just before is it's about personal relationship, which sounds really, really important to understand how people operate well and understand each other at a personal level and understand what behaviors are acceptable around the table or enabling around the table. Do you think the conversation about behavior is an entry point into talking about values, which is a harder conversation because behaviors are manifestations of values.
Absolutely, because I think behavior is sort of the front-facing window of values. So
Mm.
you can talk about being respectful, but actually, how does your behavior help to
Mm.
uphold respect? Because it's a really easy thing to say, and I've lost track of the number of organisations that have got lovely values charts of which respect is right at the top, but it doesn't manifest itself in the way that people treat each other or treat the organisation or treat staff. So that's the real test, right? Is if you are really serious about your values and are actually living them. And probably one of the best examples I've got is that I chair a elderly and disabled home-based care organisation where the three values for the organisation that everybody, board, staff, and there's conversations with our clients as well, everybody knows, and they are love, care, and professionalism. And while they might be quite big words like respect, we've been able to describe to people what the expectations of behaviour are in order for us to feel that they are subscribing to those three values. And so we say to our care workers, you can love your job as much as you like, and you can be a really great colleague to your co-workers, and you can be really diligent at your work. But if you turn up even 10 minutes late to shower one of your customers and she's been sitting there waiting for you, you are not acting in accordance with, in fact, any of those values. And so they're worked into people's performance agreements. And for us at a board, it's part of our board approach to decision making, to the point where we've got really hard decisions to make. And we just had an organisational restructure recently, which was hard. That gave us a framework, a values framework, to say, well, what's going to be okay in terms of our restructure plan? What is not negotiable? What are areas that we might think a bit more on? And so I absolutely believe that that's the link between values and behaviours. Behaviours are where the values actually manifest themselves or don't.
Yeah. And this is a great example, it sounds, of an organization and a board where the values and behaviors were very clear. And when you had to face that restructure process, you could go back to this as a team and actually check in with yourself. And it sounds like you had foundations you could rely upon in order to be able to make the best decisions you could in a difficult situation, right?
That's right. And it doesn't make it any easier, but it does give us a really good basis for talking about, well, what if we did this? What would be the consequences if we went down this plan as opposed to this plan? And one of the things that helps us decide which pathway is the extent to which the pathway really does still align with the values. And I think there's a connection there between behaviours as being what you see, values as being what you want to uphold by your behaviour, ethics being the compass that you use to determine what those things look like.
And I want to pick up, but maybe in a minute, I'll pick up on the depths of this work and what you mentioned earlier in terms of how difficult these conversations may be, because I know you've got other great insights and examples about how you get there, how you get to the depth. But before we do this, maybe, do you have an example where maybe things didn't go so well because keeping things confidential and high level enough and confidential enough, of course, in this conversation, but where things maybe didn't go so well or the process was harder because the group of governors did not have that shared clarity, maybe on values, behaviors? Would you have an example you could share?
From a few years back, a board I was on where we'd been a fairly stable group for at least probably a year and a half, which is quite a long time in the scheme of things of a governance board if you think about quite regular turnover every couple of years. And then we had a new member appointed. And in the process of him arriving, it was made very clear to us by both him and also by the appointing powers that he was coming onto the board with a particular philosophy, a particular political ethos, a particular purpose in terms of being on the board, which didn't actually line up with what we felt the organisation's purpose and ethos was. So he arrived. We think, hindsight's a fantastic thing, right? When we think back on it, we think, wow, maybe there was something missing in our induction process at the time that didn't make it clear to him, well, sure, you come to us with these things, but now that you're here, the acceptable behaviour, ethos, values for the organisation are these things and what's going to be your contribution. And because we didn't have that conversation, his contribution to the decision making was being guided by his ethos. The rest of us were being guided by the organisation's ethos. And it wasn't long before we clashed. And it took us a long time. One of the consequences of the clash was him making a very public statement about his unhappiness with a particular decision that we'd made as a board, the board that included him, by the way. And it took a long time for us to come back together as one decision-making unit. And I suspect for some of my colleagues, they never did really rebuild the trust. And this is the other aspect to it, right? Is that it can only work as if there is trust in the group. Because again, easy to say the values and easy to have individual behaviours. But if you're not trusting of the other people who share your role, it's really difficult to move as a strong decision-making unit. For me personally, the learning out of me, and it's a kind of a double-edged sword really, was that the difference in ethos initially made me close my ears to anything that he had to say, right? So as soon as he started talking, it was like, I'm not interested, we're not on the same wavelength. But I realised I wasn't actually doing justice to my role as a governor, which is to consider all views before you make a decision. And I realised 9 times out of 10, he was raising things that I would never have thought of. So I almost felt like I had to go forward to come back, to get back to what my moral compass says is the right thing to be doing. But I needed to explore his views and the views of others to keep testing my own one. And there were times actually where I would hear him speak and I'd think, actually, I'd never thought about that. That sounds like a better thing to do. But because of the lack of us taking time at the beginning to kind of set our collective relationship, we struggled the whole way.
Yeah, and there's something there, it sounds, and you mentioned that to me before about the early conversations and recognizing that, our collective ethical framework can't be just the sum of the parts, can't be the sum of what each director brings to the table. These are very difficult conversations, and they're not like just a one-off conversation. Clearly, there need to be an ongoing commitment to having these conversations. But do you have any advice, any example of something that can be done to help go beyond individual contribution to find that alignment?
Your point about you can't just have one conversation and hope that it works out right is one of the fundamental factors, I think, that you've got to have regular layering of conversations to kind of reinforce what's needed. In New Zealand Māori culture, there is a process called whakawhanaungatanga, which a lot of people are starting to recognise as being making the space to connect with each other so you get to understand each other. So when you do things together, you do it with the understanding of what everybody is bringing. And that doesn't mean that you like it or agree with it, but you do it on a more informed basis. And in the boards I'm on, and more as I move in different governance spaces, I've seen the value of applying that process, but in layers. So, often there's a temptation when people first meet is to roll out your CV so everybody knows everything that you've done and what you're about. But that doesn't actually tell people about your perspectives, your philosophies, your worldview. It tells people what you've done, but that's not that helpful in terms of when you're sitting alongside people to make decisions together, right? What you really want to know is what drives your thinking. What are your philosophies? What are the principles that you hold fast to, and why? How did you get to be like that? For me, and the fact that Māori have actually got a term for it is quite a cool thing, right? Because they realised a long time ago that relationships are important. So actually putting a name to the process of forging and strengthening those relationships, I think, is one of the best homegrown governance practices that we've got in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because it makes sense. Because if you think about the reverse, and I still see this happen now and then, the fact that a whole block of strangers can just turn up together in a room and then, okay, let's make decisions together, is pretty weird when you think about it. But I often hear people justify it and say, well, we've just got to get on with the business, right? The business of making decisions. And I'm thinking, well, understanding the decision makers is part of the business of making really good decisions. And in fact, you're reducing the likelihood of those decisions being good ones if you're just going to go straight to what's the decisions. I think that's for me. And again, I find it strange. If I'm going to have conversations with people I don't know, I find it strange that there isn't space made to actually understand who they are. And so I've seen both, right? I've seen the benefits of taking that time and taking it regularly. It has actually meant better decision-making processes. And I've seen what happens when you don't invest any time at all in the relationship and you go straight to the business, and how hard people struggle, particularly if you can't reach an early consensus around something. People get baffled, like, why would you think that? Because they haven't made the time to realise what does drive people's thinking.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes sense.
And Caren, are there other Maori protocols or other cultural frameworks or protocols that you use?
So I'm a Cook Islands Māori, so born in New Zealand, but so very closely related to New Zealand Māori. And I guess we use the same sort of practice, though we don't have a term for it. But it's also, the other thing I think about as a Cook Islander is that, I've been brought up in a culture where collective decision-making is absolutely inherent in everything that we do. And some of it's been a matter of necessity. When you come from small places with sparse resources, you have to be good at collective decision-making or else you die or resources run out. And so I feel like we've been automatically wired for governance in a way because that's how culturally we have developed, how we've kept ourselves strong as people. It's probably only just lately, though, we've realised it, because often, we don't really have words for governance.
Yeah.
But I guess that process of collective decision-making is something that we've been doing our whole life. So I think I've only recently put some value on it. And, my observation that probably the first governors I knew were my parents, because they were involved in our culture and they were also involved in collective decision-making, which was contributing to shaping what was right and what was wrong for our communities, and then for our families, and then for us as the younger people. But I wasn't conscious of it as a process. It's just that's just what happened.
Yeah. And so that's a beautiful point, right? That your individual ethics are very heavily influenced by your past, by your history, by your culture, by your social norms, your cultural norms, whether or not people think about it and realize it. But I suppose what I'm hearing, the more I hear you speak, is when you agree to take this responsibility to sit on a board and govern or steward an organization, you need to do that work. You need to do this work on yourself, whether you are aware enough of the need to do this work, or whether you need a group of people, your fellow governors or your chair, to help facilitate this process of looking inside and understand yourself. It's absolutely necessary, isn't it?
I think so. And colleagues I work with think so. And I think, there's two layers to it. One is for you as an individual, being really clear about why are you coming to this board table? What do you think you can contribute? What's motivating you to be there? And as part of what you're bringing, what are your values, your principles that underpin your thinking? Because then the next conversation is, and how does this align with what the organisation stands for? And that's got to be, I think, part of your decision-making before you even start the job is, are you in the right place where there is alignment? Because if there's not, you're going to struggle down the track. But I also think it's, as you said, the responsibility of the board and the organisation to make space for those conversations. As we do, boards have induction processes. For me, it should be a integral part of board induction that there's a conversation around what's okay around here. And it's not actually just a matter of the new person learning what the incumbent people do. The minute you join a board, the board becomes a new team, right? It's not you've got to come up to speed with everyone else. You've got to reset as a team. And that's a perfect time to say, okay, well, now that we're a new team, let's just check what's okay and what's not okay before we head off together.
So maybe a practical question here, Caren. How important do you think it is for things to be formalized versus stay informal and conversational? So when you are as a board on this journey to understanding each other's values and contribution and ethics and purpose, and you're shaping together that collective ethical framework, say, and you're having these conversations about behaviors, what's acceptable, what's not, and how we make decisions. Do you think it's very important that things get formalized? Do you think it doesn't matter? It depends on how the group wants to operate. What would you say about that?
What I would say is that I think, and I'm just reflecting on whether I think formalised is the right word. I think there are governance practices that need to be included as part of the governance architecture to help support a board to work really well. that can actually sit with some currently generally accepted processes. Induction is one really good example, right? Most good boards I know have induction processes. Why not expand that induction to including a piece where you're inducting the board together and having a conversation and coming to agreement about what are your rules of engaging together? How are you going to become familiar with each other's approach, each other's ethics, each other's behaviours? Here's a really practical thing. A really good board I was on, and it was a big board, 12 of us, and time was of the essence, but we would have a dinner the night before the board meeting. We'd take turns, each dinner, 3 of us would have 5 minutes each to share with colleagues things that made us tick. So these aren't things that they could read on our CV. They're things about how we think. And I probably learnt more from those than I did from sitting next to my colleagues at the board table, because I understood a bit more about their approach to making decisions. So induction is one thing. Board evaluations, I mean, that's already accepted as being something a strong board will do. And quite often those evaluation processes have been to evaluate, well, literally that. Are you doing all the governance processes that you should do? But good boards was they use it as a chance to take the temperature on what's the state of our culture and our relationship as a board. Do people feel like that they can speak their mind? Do they feel like we have good, robust discussions where you can have a difference of opinion, but we get to a decision? Are there things that are really annoying people about how, you can test for it as part of some already established governance practices. So I don't think we're asking people to do any more. In fact, it's that sort of short-term investment to help the longer-term job of making decisions much, much easier. Because as I said, I've seen what happens when boards don't take the time to understand each other, and it just makes difficult and complex decisions even more difficult.
Yes. And I think you said to me before, like, you need to test the ethical standards before things go wrong, because it's your insurance as a board as well, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's also seeing it as that as a board, there are a number of things that you can do in advance before getting to the really hard stuff, right? Because history tells us you will have disagreements. You'll have people get upset about things. You'll get people who might stray away from working in the interests of the organisation. All of this stuff is possible because it's happened before. So knowing that, what's the plan for managing when it gets there? Or mitigating the risk of it even getting there in the first place.
Yeah. And so what I'm also thinking as you talk about how the role of the board in how the organization comes across as well in the external sphere. We haven't talked about that yet in terms of, I mean, I suppose in some organization doesn't matter that much. In other contexts, the board does contribute to the reputation of the organization externally as well. So there's also something we've talked a lot about the internal work at personal level, at board, as a group level, working with the senior management team. What is the next step in terms of demonstrating such values and ethics externally in situations where it matters?
There's a situation currently being played out in the public arena where a board has made a particular decision about a member of their staff, and the public are seeing the results of this decision, saying it's the wrong decision, and it's very much shaping their view around this board and what they think is right and wrong. So they're judging it based on the board's behaviour without completely knowing the facts. But this is one of the challenges for boards, right, is that their reputation is based on how people see them and see the actions that they've taken. In this case, it's an action that the public feel is wrong, therefore they feel the board is wrong. And a lot of people have got very upset about it outside of the organisation and are expressing their views very loudly and publicly. And this is, in the absence of people knowing all the facts. But I'm going based on the reactions I'm seeing in social media and statements in the press. And I'm looking at it as a governor, sort of feeling quite sorry for everyone involved, because, there are hard decisions to be made at the board table. There's people's livelihoods, there's emotions, and everybody has a view on what is right and what is wrong, even in the absence of facts. And so, if I put myself in their shoes, bearing in mind I don't know any of the facts of things, but I guess what I'd be really concerned about is, one, our reputation as a decision-making group, because obviously people are questioning this decision. I would be worried about reputation of being fair or unfair, because that's a lot of the sort of public rhetoric that we are hearing, out there. And so even just taking those two things, thinking about what could have been done better in order to prevent the situation, because it seems to just be growing and growing in terms of them not coming to a resolution.
Right.
And there's a whole lot of people affected. So I'm using that as an example because it's really easy for people from the outside to look at the behaviours and use that as a proxy for determining, well, what are the values and the principles that this board has, and not let the facts get in the way, right, of a good story. And that's a challenge for every board member, and every board is how you demonstrate that your decision making is fair. So I think the lesson for me is, when you're making really big decisions like that, is how do you communicate them? How do you use your own kind of values frameworks as a guide for making those decisions? I know that they've got certain values around. One of them is manaakitanga, which is the Māori word basically for taking good care of other people, being hospitable. So the public looks and goes, that doesn't look very hospitable. That doesn't look like you're taking care. So, I think one of the challenges for boards externally is how they demonstrate by their behaviours that the values they say they subscribe to, that those are actually underpinning. So again, in the absence of knowing any of the facts, I can understand people going, well, you say your values are this, but it doesn't look like that.
Yes.
And therefore starting to infect people's, the credibility of their decision making.
Yeah. And so with no judgment on this particular situation, of course, as you say, like in terms of the lessons, there's something there about, as you pointed out, being ready to know, being clear on how, as a board, we want to come across, communicate our decisions, the narrative around it, how this is all packaged up, not in a bad way, but presented to the wider public. We need to be able to make assumptions that these difficult situations are going to happen, that there will be backlash, for instance. And so is there something there as well about being ready to obviously manage the situation now that's happened?
So, I mean, probably one of my own examples is in the past few years where I've chaired a funding organisation. And of course, when you're on a board of a funder, and where resources are limited, there are going to be people who are really happy and people who are not, depending on those who were able to get funding and those. I know when I put my hand up first to be on this board, I was really conscious that that's the sort of environment I'm going into, that there are winners and losers. Well, this is how people frame it, right? And what it means, though, to me, is that you've got to be able to really clearly justify that you've made the right decision. And there's right in terms of we followed the right process and we got to here. But there's right in terms of it sits well with our values, our principles, as being the right thing to do. And it's very easy to demonstrate the first, because you can say, there were 10 criteria, we went through all the criteria, right? But when people are getting really emotional about the decision, they go straight to, but was it the right thing to do? And so in my case, I had an organisation that was very upset about missing out on funding, because in my mind, in their mind, it wasn't right. Right in accordance with what's right for them. Yes. We had done wrong by them, even though we could demonstrate. And one of my lessons from that is probably we moved a bit too slow to share the rationale for the decision so people could understand. So this is this is one of the challenges when you're in decision making, right, is being able to clearly and in a timely manner articulate the rationale for your decision. So even if people aren't happy about it, they understand it.
Yeah. So there's the fixing part as well, right? And maybe we should take a few more minutes to think about the fixing part of things, because that needs to be part of the plan. So there's fixing in terms of the wider public perception, or fixing in terms of, a beneficiary or a stakeholder of the organization, in this particular example, who you need to be able to take on the journey of this decision-making process. And you mentioned that before, Caren, that, that's why it's so important as a board to be clear on what is framing this decision-making process and being able to explain it and rationalize it with the layer of emotions as well, of course, always. When things fall apart within boards, I'd like to come back to this. When there's misalignment, what do you have guidance and advice on what to do apart from having the difficult conversations? What else is there for governance to keep in mind in terms of dealing with conflict of misalignment at board level.
If picking up on my earlier discussion about the
Yeah.
fact that good boards will front foot this, right?
Right.
They've acknowledged that they will get ready for tough times, and then when they get there, they've got a process to work through. You could be ready, and there still could be a chance that it's still a difficult conversation because along the way, trust has been eroded. And boy, once trust has been eroded within a collective, it is really hard to rebuild it. And even if some individuals can get back to a trusting place, sometimes not everyone can. And therefore the level of trust. I mean, I heard a great saying, right, that great boards move at the speed of trust. And so you can imagine once that trust has been broken, you're not moving anywhere. You are stuck. And that's really difficult. And sometimes it takes some pretty major change in terms of people leaving.
Yeah.
Right, actually removing themselves from the board. I've seen boards attempt kind of mediated conversations to try and get back. And where that has been more successful, again, has been because they've done some work at the front end and they've actually got a reference point to anchor their discussion to say, at this point in time, we said this was okay and this was not okay. And now we're here. Is that okay? So, I mean, I think it is really difficult. And 9 times out of 10 where boards have become dysfunctional, it's been because of the breakdown in relationships. It's very rarely been because of a technical issue, right? It's been because not enough attention has been paid to the importance of maintaining good relationships and taking the temperature on them. Are they still at the right level? And that's both internally, but also with external stakeholders as well. And I've seen organisations over time lose their social licence because they haven't paid attention. And either they haven't paid attention to taking the temperature on the relationships, or they've been perceived to have breached their own values, their own principles, their own ethics. And that really, really does kill people's trust in organisations. It wasn't very helpful in terms of how to fix things.
It's all about intentions, and I think it just highlights your point about there's not a one size fits all, formula. There's not one single model. You gave us some examples of things that can be done, and I think it's really important to keep the practicalities, what can be done in mind. There's no silver bullet, is there? And also, there shouldn't be, because any pathway, any tool, any framework should be designed by this group of people in the way they see it fit best for them. So one of the red thread maybe throughout everything you shared so generously with us today is that intentionality that needs to be there from the very beginning, but also throughout the board growing together and shaping itself, making decisions. There's the need for checking in all the time. And asking ourselves as board whether we are on the right track, whether we are living by our values and our framework, and preempting when things may not go so well and when things are going to be difficult. So there's a very important investment of time and effort and emotions and energy that need to go into working together.
Absolutely. And I think often that level of that intention to invest the energy and time is often underestimated. And that gets down to the really practical thing of there's lots of people who still don't understand what the job is of a board. In fact, there's a big difference between people thinking, I've just got to go to meetings versus I'm responsible for making decisions with this collective of people that are going to affect the likelihoods of the people who work for us and the people we serve. And by the way, I've got responsibility for resources and assets to enable us to do this. So, so that's quite a difference in the understanding, and therefore in the understanding of just what you need to do the job properly and in a way that's going to be productive, which is a little bit of my life's mission to help people understand that, because I do fundamentally believe that if governance is working well, whether it's in the private sector or public or not-for-profit, then better decisions get made, resources get better used, organisations can sustain themselves and pace themselves well, and then actually there's better outcomes socially, economically, environmentally, because the right decision maker, and in fact there's less risks because people have thought about risks and consequences and have been able to front foot that. So, and when you really test people about the fact, because people often say governance, what's that? But most people get touched by some governance decision pretty much every day of their life, whether it's your local council making decisions about your water if you turn the tap on, right through to central government, right through to services, but people don't think about that, but they are wearing the consequences of the decisions that are being made in every aspect of their life.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So be courageous, for listeners, maybe the younger people who are listening, who are early on the career to making a difference to out in New Zealand, whether or not they decide to become governors or not, right? In general, in order to be an ethical leader, there's a lot of courage that's needed, both looking within, but also having the hard conversations, be strategic conversations or very personal conversations, because these make an incredible difference to being a good steward for an organization, whichever seat you sit in. You need to have that level of intentionality with yourself and that level of commitment to others around you to have the brave, courageous conversations.
Absolutely. And two things, if I think about in my own community, my own Cookans community, and in the broader Pacific community in which I live in, there's two thoughts I have around this whole question of ethical leadership and using ethics as your compass for guiding your decision making. Because in my mind, that's what they're there for, helping you to decide either individually or as part of a collective what's right and what's not right. And I mean, I come from a culture where my ancestors were the most expert navigators in the world, right? They navigated the biggest piece of ocean in the world in a way that if this was, in 2025, they would be seen as being our technological wizards. Of if you are responsible for a group of people in the middle of the ocean on a sea craft, right, and with potentially bad weather, running out of resources, even if you're clear about where you're going, you've got to have really strong decision-making compasses in order to make decisions that you feel are going to protect people and keep them safe. Because this is the other thing about ethical leadership. It is about keeping people and resources and processes safe. So I think about my ancestors as being kind of the best experts in that, because they literally were making life and death decisions every minute of the way on their journey. And I feel like maybe I don't make life and death decisions, but I'm certainly making important decisions. And the level of courage you have to be clear and confident and be able to communicate that to the people who need to know, because otherwise there are consequences. So I think about that as being my guide for why it's important that you're really clear about what's right or not right, because it has consequences for the people that you are serving, and not just for you. As an individual. I'm also really grateful for that too, because it probably helps keep me in good stead when I'm part of those decision-making processes. What would my ancestors do? How would they decide to, what is the right path to go on? And the last thing I'll say on that is that, I've been in situations over my 20-odd years of governing where in the process of making a decision, I've known when I felt uncomfortable, thinking, is this really sitting well? And I've had to make a decision. What can I live with? So it's not even really do I agree or disagree, because there've been lots of things I've disagreed with. But can I live with this long enough to keep on the journey? Because if the answer is I can't live with it, well, then it's time to get off the boat. And that's always a choice that you do have, right? If you want to walk away with your own ethics and values intact. Thankfully, I've only really had to do that once in my life, and it was difficult. I didn't want to go because I believed in the organisation, what it stood for, but I knew I'd got to a point where I was struggling to be part of the collective making decisions, and where there'd been a couple of decisions that were out of alignment with my own ethics, values, and certainly behaviours.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you, Caren. I think we should finish with these two beautiful stories of yours, and a call to action to the listeners. One is maybe, what would my ancestors do in this situation if they can think this way? Or the other one is, what is my heart telling me? Can I live with this? Can I reconcile it? Or do I need to make some hard decisions? Thank you so much for all your wisdom today. It's been such a pleasure having you on this episode, Caren. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity and the space to have the conversation with you. Again, as you rightly said, part of being intentional is being able to articulate out loud what you think is important in your leadership space. And I hope it was articulate, but as you identified very early on, I think good boards and good leaders make space to examine how they're making decisions. And part of that is what's the compass that they are using in order to guide that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This was an episode of Ethical Leadership, Voices of Aotearoa, New Zealand, a podcast collection commissioned by the Brian Picot Chair in Ethical Leadership, Aritahi, at Victoria University of Wellington. I hope you enjoyed the episodes as much as I'm enjoying the fabulous conversations with our guest speakers. Stay tuned for more.